at a parish in New Mexico, and someone raised the issue of religious statuary, and doesn't that violate the injunction against idols? And I said, no, it doesn't. They raised the golden calf incident, where Aaron made the golden calf and said, "This is your God, O Israel, worship it." And there happened to be some statues of the Holy Family right next to me, and I gestured to them. Now, has your priest ever told you, "These are your gods, O Catholics, worship them"? And there was a resounding no from the congregation. And then I pointed out that in the Old Testament, in fact, I was just writing about this earlier this week, there are numerous examples of religious statuary that God himself commanded. You had the cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant. You had the cherubim that God commanded to be worked into the panels of the tabernacle. You had the cherubim that were all over the walls of Ezekiel's visionary temple. You had the cherubim in Solomon's temple. You had pictures of supernatural celestial beings in a religious context, the tabernacle, the temple, Ezekiel's visionary temple. You had these all over the place, and God himself endorsed it and commanded it. And what I then said was, okay, to the audience, if it's okay for them in the Old Testament and in the New Testament and in Ezekiel's vision to have pictures of angels in their churches, then it's okay for us. And at this point, I pointed to a statue of Michael the Archangel at the back of the sanctuary. It's okay for us to have pictures of angels and statues of angels today.
And of course, God destroyed Israel for what they then did with their images, and that was that they transferred to those images those things that God reserves to himself. And I would simply close by asserting that a worship and service in the religious context is reserved by God to himself.
And we're going to have to leave it at that. We've got a lot of callers hanging on the line. We're going to get to them as quickly as possible before we go to station break. Let me mention once again Roman Catholics and Evangelicals, Agreements and Differences by Norman L. Geisler and Ralph McKenzie, available through the Christian Research Institute, along with the articles that appeared in the Christian Research Journal as radio offer number 336. When you call or write the Christian Research Institute, enclosing a donation of $25 or more to our ongoing work, not only here in the United States, but internationally as well. Our address, the Christian Research Institute, Box 500, San Juan Capistrano, California, zip code 92693. Our telephone number, 714-855-9926. And if you're ordering using Visa, MasterCard, or the Discover card, the number is toll-free, 800-443-9797. If you just tuned in, our interview today with James White of Alpha and Omega Ministries. He's done an excellent book on the whole King James Version only controversy right now. As we speak, or shortly after we speak, he's going to be working on continuing to work on a brand new book coming out with Bethany House on the actual issue of Roman Catholicism. James Aiken also writing a book on what Catholics believe and why. He, of course, is with Catholic Answers. Both very, very fine individuals, and I think are bringing a lot of light to the subject of Roman Catholicism and the Protestant Church, differences as well as agreements. We'll be back in a moment with more. Please stay tuned. And welcome back to the Bible Answer Man broadcast. I'm your host, Hank Hanegraaff, president of the Christian Research Institute, in studio today with James White of Alpha and Omega Ministries and James Aiken of Catholic Answers. We're answering your questions on the whole debate with regard to the differences between Roman Catholics and Evangelicals, agreements as well as disagreements. Your calls, I want to go to Vincent, San Diego, California, listening on KPRZ. Welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you, Hank. Excellent program. Both of these gentlemen are very heavy hitters.
And with the emphasis on gentlemen.
This question would be directed to Mr. White and or Mr. Aiken, possibly to Mr. White. Since most people until recently could neither read nor write, and mechanical printing didn't come into being until the 15th century, and Christ never wrote anything, nor did he command his apostles to write anything, isn't sola scriptura illogical? And one other comment, if you would comment on this, rather, one other. Why are, of the 350 quotations used by Christ and the apostles from the Old Testament, why are 300 of them from the Septuagint, or the long Greek canon, which is used by the Catholic Church, which was rejected by the early, that is after Christ died, Jews of that era, and the reformers in the 16th
By the way, great question, well articulated, James White.
Well, first of all, in regards to the idea of people not being able to read, so on and so forth, first of all, that's not necessarily a true statement. Historically, there may have been periods during the Dark Ages where literacy was very low, but certainly at the time of Christ, you have Peter writing, and you have a much different situation there. But my main problem with the question is that I think it begs the issue. You don't have a command to a number of the Old Testament prophets to write. That doesn't mean that what they wrote was not necessarily what God wanted to have them write. The Old Testament, that argument will be just as valid against the purpose and the function of the Old Testament as it would be against the Bible as a whole. And again, we go to what the Lord Jesus Christ himself did in regards to holding men responsible for what God said to them. We need to remember, especially when talking about things like divorce, what did the Lord Jesus do when he was in conflict with the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees? He said, have you not read what? What God said to you. Now, we've got to back up and listen to what the Lord Jesus is saying there. And I believe that the Lord Jesus' example needs to be our example. And he held those men responsible for what God had revealed in the Scriptures that they had at that time. Now, in regards to the Septuagint, yes, the vast majority of Old Testament citations are from the Septuagint. The problem, and again, I refer people to Beckwith's fine work, the Old Testament canon, the New Testament church. The problem is the assumption that the Septuagint, from which they were citing, had this, what he calls, long Greek canon. The Septuagints that we have, the earliest Septuagints we have, are all Christian in origin. And it is very questionable, very, very questionable. It's really old scholarship to just automatically assume what's known as the Alexandrian canon over against what's known as the Palestinian canon. And Beckwith's work, I think, documents that very, very clearly. I'd suggest that Vincent, if he hasn't had a chance to look at that, I believe it's published by Erdman. The Old Testament canon, the New Testament church, I think does an excellent job in dismantling that assumption and demonstrates that that's exactly what it is, an assumption, not actually a fact.
Okay, to respond to both of those things, I think the caller's point was a little more subtle concerning Jesus' not giving the apostles a command to write. If I understand what the caller was saying, well, look, I mean, if writing were the primary means of teaching doctrine, then Jesus would have put his emphasis on that when he talked to the apostles. He would have said, go out and write. Instead, he said, go out and preach. And so the oral transmission of the gospel is what's going to be primary. If you look in